The Spanish Empire in the 1590s was the wealthiest and most powerful state on earth, controlling a global empire. It followed the pattern and entered a century of grinding decline, becoming a second-rate power. The British Empire in 1914 ruled over a quarter of the world's population. It followed the pattern and within 40 years was bankrupt, its empire dismantled. The Soviet Union in 1945 was a nuclear superpower controlling half of Europe. It followed the pattern, and in 1991 it collapsed completely, ceasing to exist. 3 times in modern history, 3 superpowers followed the 7-stage sequence and were broken by it. And here's what should terrify you. The United States has already completed 5 of the 7 stages, and most people don't even realize we're in the pattern. This is the story of the sequence of imperial collapse, why they always think they're different, and why the math says we're next. This is the lore of money. We explore how money shapes history, power, and society. Subscribe for more. Before we go through the pattern, you need to understand what imperial collapse actually looks like. Not in textbooks, but in practice. Collapse doesn't start with a foreign invasion or a sudden revolution. It starts with the quiet, internal failure of complex systems. The math stops working, the promises can't be kept, and the money starts to lie. At first, the decline is invisible to most people because the symbols of power are still there. The military parades continue, the currency is still accepted, and the government still functions. But beneath the surface, the economic foundations are rotting away, hollowed out by debt and a loss of productive energy. Then comes the acceleration, where decades of slow decay suddenly cascade into a crisis that unfolds in months or even weeks. That's not theoretical. That's what happened to Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Let's look at how it happened 3 times in the exact same way. Our first case study is the Spanish Empire, the first truly global superpower. In the late 1500s, Spain was the master of the world. Silver from its mines in the Americas flooded the global economy, funding armies that were the most feared in Europe. From its perspective, its power was absolute and permanent. But by 1590, it had already entered the first stage of the pattern. Stage 1 is military overextension. Spain was fighting everyone, everywhere, all at once. Its primary drain was the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands, a bloody and expensive quagmire that consumed fortunes. To supply its legendary Army of Flanders, it had to maintain a complex logistical network stretching from Italy to Belgium, which was constantly under threat. At the same time, Spain was fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, funding Catholic forces in the 30 Years' War in Germany, and trying to protect its massive colonial empire from English and Dutch rivals. By the 1630s, the Spanish military had around 300,000 soldiers, an impossibly large force for a pre-industrial economy to support. It was a strategic nightmare, a commitment so vast that it bled the empire dry. This led directly to Stage 2, currency debasement. To pay for its endless wars, the Spanish crown needed money it didn't have, so it resorted to a hidden tax on its own people. While the silver coins used for international trade were mostly kept pure, Spain's domestic copper coins, called vellon, were systematically destroyed. The government would recall all the coins, melt them down, mix in less valuable metals, and then re-stamp them at double or even quadruple their original face value. The crown kept the difference, a short-term gain that caused long-term disaster. This practice destroyed public faith in the money, fueled runaway hyperinflation inside Spain, and crippled local businesses who had no idea what their money was actually worth from one day to the next. This financial desperation locked Spain into Stage 3, the debt spiral. The Spanish monarchy was addicted to debt, constantly borrowing huge sums from foreign bankers, mostly from Genoa and Germany, to fund its next military campaign. But the income from its empire, even with all the silver, was never enough to cover the costs of its wars plus the interest on its loans. This led to a repeating cycle of borrowing, defaulting on the debt, and then being forced to renegotiate for even more expensive loans in the future. By the end of his reign, King Philip II had already defaulted 4 times. This vicious cycle meant that an ever larger share of the government's revenue went directly to paying interest, leaving even less for everything else, and forcing even more borrowing. This toxic combination of war, bad money, and debt created Stage 4, the loss of productive capacity. The flood of silver from the Americas was actually a curse. It made foreign goods cheap and Spanish exports expensive, so Spain's domestic industries like textile manufacturing were hollowed out because they couldn't compete. Why invest in a difficult business when you can simply buy goods from abroad with American silver? Capital that should have gone into building new industries or improving farms was instead spent on wars, luxury imports, or non-productive status symbols like land and titles. The government made things worse. In 1609, it expelled the Moriscos, a population of converted Muslims who were a vital part of the agricultural and artisan workforce. This single decision crippled the economies of several regions. By the mid-1600s, Spain, a country with vast fertile land, had become dependent on imported food and manufactured goods because its own productive base had been sacrificed. All of this economic pain led to Stage 5, social decay. Spanish society became deeply unequal and rigid. A massive, tax-exempt nobility looked down on commerce and hard work, creating a culture that valued status over production. The government bureaucracy was bloated and corrupt. This structural rot was magnified by demographic shocks, like the massive plague of 1598 that killed nearly 10% of the population, leaving farms abandoned and cities weakened. But here is where the model needs a crucial correction. The pattern doesn't always end in a sudden, fiery collapse. For Spain, the final stages played out as a long, agonizing decline. Its currency wasn't a reserve currency in the modern sense, so Stage 6 doesn't fit perfectly. And Stage 7 wasn't a collapse, but a slow fade into irrelevance. Over the 17th century, Spain lost its hegemonic position to France, becoming a second-tier power. It remained a vast empire for another century and a half, but its time at the top was over. The pattern had bled it out, slowly and methodically. Our second case study, the British Empire, shows what happens when the pattern accelerates. In 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire in world history, and the pound sterling was the undisputed king of global finance. But the two world wars triggered the sequence with breathtaking speed. Stage 1, military overextension, happened twice in 30 years. The First World War was a cataclysm that forced the total mobilization of the British economy. At its peak, defense spending consumed an incredible 47% of the entire country's economic output. 20 years later, the Second World War was even more demanding, with defense spending hitting 52% of GDP. Britain was forced to sell off its vast overseas investments and assets just to pay for the wars, permanently changing its financial position in the world. This led directly to stages 2 and 3, currency debasement and a debt spiral. Britain went from being the world's biggest creditor nation, the world's banker, to being its biggest debtor. The financial strain forced Britain to abandon the gold standard in 1931, a massive blow to the pound's reputation for stability. The wars were funded by massive borrowing, and the national debt exploded. After World War II, Britain's debt was over 200% of its GDP, a truly astronomical number. The country was effectively bankrupt, forced to take a humiliating emergency loan from the United States in 1946. Let that sink in. The empire on which the sun never set had to borrow money from its former colony just to keep the lights on. This financial ruin accelerated Stage 4, the loss of productive capacity. Britain's industrial dominance was already fading, but the wars sealed its fate. The country failed to invest in modernizing its factories and couldn't keep up with the new industrial powers like the United States and a rebuilt Germany. By the early 1980s, Britain, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, was importing more manufactured goods than it exported. The industrial heart of the empire had stopped beating. This economic transformation drove Stage 5, social decay, though decay is a subjective term. The old rigid class structure that defined imperial Britain was shattered by the wars. A new consensus emerged for a massive welfare state, which created new social stability, but also a new set of economic burdens. For Britain, Stage 6 was the key event, the loss of reserve currency status. Before the wars, the pound sterling was the anchor of the global financial system. After the wars, the United States was the only major power with its industrial base intact in a massive creditor position. The transition was made official at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, which established the US dollar as the new center of the system. The final public humiliation came during the Suez Crisis of 1956. When Britain tried to act like an old-school imperial power in Egypt, the United States used financial pressure, threatening to sell its holdings of pounds, to force a British withdrawal. The message was clear. Britain could no longer act on the world stage without America's permission. The pound's status was gone, But like Spain, Britain did not collapse in Stage 7. The empire was dismantled, but the United Kingdom itself survived, transforming into a middle-tier European power. It was a managed decline, a painful adjustment, but not a disintegration of the state. Our final case study, the Soviet Union, shows the pattern in its most brutal and rapid form. The USSR was not a market economy, so some of the financial stages don't apply in the same way, but the underlying logic of the pattern holds perfectly. Stage 1, military overextension, was the central story of the Cold War. The arms race against the United States placed a burden on the Soviet economy that it simply could not bear. By the mid-1980s, military spending may have consumed as much as 21% of the entire Soviet economy, nearly 3 times the burden on the US at the time. This massive diversion of money, resources, and scientific talent into the military-industrial complex starved the civilian economy of investment and innovation, causing it to stagnate and then decay. Stages 2 and 3, debasement and debt, took a unique Soviet form. The ruble wasn't a real currency traded on world markets. Its value was fake, set by the state. The real debasement was systemic. The government printed money to cover its expenses, but there were almost no consumer goods to buy in the stores. This created what economists called a massive monetary overhang. Trillions of rubles sitting in people's bank accounts with nowhere to go. It was a hidden hyperinflation waiting to explode. This led to Stage 4, a catastrophic loss of productive capacity. The centrally planned Soviet economy was a disaster. It was grossly inefficient and incapable of innovation. Its agricultural sector failed so completely that the USSR, once a global breadbasket, had to import massive amounts of grain from the West just to feed its own people. The system wasn't just stagnating, it was going backward. By the 1980s, this economic failure had produced Stage 5, deep social decay. Soviet society was rotting from the inside. Alcoholism was rampant. The public health system was collapsing, with life expectancy for men actually falling. And most importantly, the ideology that held the whole system together was dead. No one, not even the leadership, still believed in the communist promise. This loss of faith created an ideological vacuum that was quickly filled by nationalism in the Soviet republics, from the Baltics to Central Asia. For the Soviet Union, Stage 6 was irrelevant because the ruble was never a reserve currency. But Stage 7 was absolute collapse. The combination of economic paralysis, ideological bankruptcy, and nationalist movements proved fatal. When a hardline coup failed in August 1991, the central government's authority vanished overnight. The republics declared independence one by one. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. It was not a slow decline or a transformation. It was a rapid and total disintegration. So that is the pattern. It's a 7-stage sequence that acts as a feedback loop of destruction. Let's define the stages clearly. Stage 1, military overextension. The nation's global commitments vastly outstrip its ability to pay for them, forcing it to divert resources from its productive domestic economy to a non-productive military. Stage 2, currency debasement. To fund this overextension, the state begins to degrade its own currency, either by literally mixing cheaper metals into its coins, as Spain did, or by printing vast sums of money to cover its deficits, which erodes the currency's purchasing power. Stage 3, debt spiral. This money creation is paired with massive borrowing. The national debt begins to grow much faster than the economy itself, and an ever-increasing share of the nation's income goes to simply paying interest on past debt, forcing even more borrowing in a vicious cycle. Stage 4, loss of productive capacity. The combination of military spending, bad money, and high debt starves the real economy of investment. The nation stops making things and starts relying on imports, financed by debt. The industrial base that created its wealth withers away. Stage 5, social decay. The economic pain from the first 4 stages creates deep social divisions. Inequality grows, trust in institutions collapses, and political polarization becomes extreme. The nation loses its sense of shared purpose and turns on itself. Stage 6, loss of reserve currency status. For the global hegemon, this is the point of no return. Other nations lose faith in the empire's currency and stop using it to store their wealth and conduct trade. This removes the empire's ability to finance its deficits cheaply, which leads to Stage 7, collapse. This can take many forms: a rapid disintegration like the Soviet Union, a managed decline like Britain, or a long, slow fade into irrelevance like Spain. But the result is the same. The superpower is no longer a superpower. Now let's apply that pattern to the United States in 2025. Stage 1. Military overextension. Check. The United States maintains around 750 military bases in over 80 countries, with troops stationed across the globe. Its annual defense budget is nearly $750 billion, accounting for almost 40% of all military spending on Earth. This vast global posture, from Europe to the Indo-Pacific, creates immense and ongoing costs. Stage 2. Currency debasement. The evidence here is debated, but the trend is clear. Since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the US dollar has lost approximately 96% of its purchasing power. This accelerated dramatically after 1971, when the dollar was fully disconnected from gold. The massive expansion of the money supply during the COVID-19 pandemic triggered the highest inflation seen in 40 years. While the dollar remains dominant globally for now, its domestic value has been systematically eroded over a century. Stage 3. Debt spiral. Check. The U.S. national debt has surpassed $38 trillion. The debt-to-GDP ratio is over 120%, a level not seen since the peak of World War II. The pace of borrowing is accelerating, with the last $1 trillion of debt added in just 71 days. The annual interest payments on this debt are now projected to exceed $1.2 trillion, more than the entire defense budget. The government's own projections show the debt growing faster than the economy for the indefinite future. This is the mathematical definition of a debt spiral. Stage 4. Loss of productive capacity. Check. The U.S. has undergone a profound deindustrialization. Manufacturing jobs have fallen from 30% of the workforce to less than 8%. Millions of well-paying jobs for workers without a college degree have vanished, hollowing out the middle class. While manufacturing output has risen due to automation, the social structure that was built on that industrial base has been lost, creating deep economic and regional divides. Stage 5. Social decay. Check. The United States is experiencing extreme political polarization. The gap between the parties is wider than ever, and politics has become a battle of mutual hatred. Trust in every major institution, from the government to the media, is at or near historic lows. This is compounded by a sense of social fragmentation, isolation, and deep inequality, leaving many people feeling that the system is rigged and the social contract is broken. The United States is clearly exhibiting the symptoms of the first 5 stages of the pattern. The only things holding the system together are the final 2 stages. So what comes next? Stage 6 is the future of the dollar's reserve status. This is the cornerstone of American power. It's the exorbitant privilege that allows the U.S. to sustain debt levels that would destroy any other country. For now, that status is secure, mainly because there is no credible alternative. The euro lacks a unified government, and China's currency is not freely traded and is controlled by an authoritarian regime nobody trusts. The greatest threat to the dollar isn't a rival, but a self-inflicted wound, a political crisis so severe that it causes the world to lose faith in America's stability. If that faith is lost, the consequences would be severe. The dollar's value would fall sharply, interest rates in the U.S. would spike, inflation would soar as the cost of imports skyrockets. Americans would be forced into a painful period of adjustment, with a significant decline in their standard of living. This leads to the question of Stage 7, collapse. History shows this doesn't have to mean a sudden end. The Byzantine Empire managed its decline for centuries through clever diplomacy and strategic adaptation. Chinese dynasties collapsed and were reborn repeatedly over 2,000 years, showing a remarkable capacity for regeneration. An American decline might look more like Britain's, a transformation into a normal, significant country, but no longer the global hegemon. 3 times, 3 superpowers followed this pattern: the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union. Each believed they were exceptional. Each believed they were different. Each believed the old rules of history and mathematics didn't apply to them. They were wrong every single time. We are telling ourselves the same lies right now. But the pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot run up debt faster than your economy grows forever. You cannot replace production with consumption financed by a printing press. You cannot survive the loss of social cohesion and internal trust. The sequence is locked in. The only question is the timing. The pattern says the end of the American century is coming, and when the final stage arrives, it probably won't be slow. It will feel sudden, a cascade of failures that were building just beneath the surface for decades. 3 times it happened before. The pattern says we're next. If this opened your eyes to where we actually are in the sequence, subscribe. Because when we hit the final stages, you'll want to understand what happened and why. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They're written in the past, and I'll show you where to look.